Hello everyone, welcome back to our journey through the literary periods of English literature. So far we have explored many different literary periods, from the passionate emotions of Romanticism to the ideas of the neoclassical age, and in the previous lesson we saw the society and its progress during the Victorian age. Welcome now to the Modernist period, a period in English literature which is considered a time of radical change, bold experimentation, and deep questioning of the past. In this lesson, I'll talk about modernism and why do we call it modernism. I'll mention its time frame and the historical background of this literary period. I'll mention the subperiods, and I'll talk about the key characteristics of the modernist period. We'll get to see some of the main authors and their literary works, especially prose and poetry, and we'll get to see the language and the literary devices used heavily during the modernist period. We'll have a quick view of art during this period, and we'll talk about the movement called the Avant-garde and its role in English literature. And of course, we'll talk about the impact and the importance of this literary period in English literature. At the end of this lesson, we'll have a comparison between the Victorian and the Modernist periods, just to get a recap as we do in every lesson. So let's get started. To start, let's keep in mind that when we mention or refer to the term modernism, we are not only talking about the modernist period in English literature. The modernist period is a part of English literature. However, modernism as a term is a broader one. It includes many different fields, including English literature. So it might be referring to something related to architecture, sociology, or many other different fields. So the modernism that I'm talking about here is the one related to literature. So modernism was a movement embracing the new. Authors sought innovative forms and techniques to make sense of a rapidly changing world. In literature, modernist writers abandoned conventional and traditional ways of writing, and they tried new, different experimental forms. So why do we call it modernism? Modernism, this term refers to the deliberate break from traditional forms and old conventions. Modernist writers saw themselves as creators of a new world reacting to a rapidly changing society. So it's a kind of break from all the traditions and the old beliefs and the traditional ways of writing. So this term was chosen to highlight modernity and the break with the past. So the most important point about this name or this term, modernism, is to break with the past. So, also some scholars refer to the words of Ezra Pound, who says, make it new, or uses this sentence, which is a desire expressed by him. And it marks a break from tradition where writers questioned old values and the classical traditions as a response to the rapidly changing world, as I mentioned. So the modernist period starts around 1910. In the next slide, you might see different age. Some claim that it started in 1901. Most importantly, it finished in 1945 with the end of World War II. Let's talk about the historical background of the modernist period. This era witnessed the rise of industrialization and urbanization. It witnessed many dramatical changes, including World War I, and later on, by the end of this period, we see World War II. and many other conflicts. We see the rise of technological advancements like radios, cars, and also cinemas, and many other inventions. And in this period, humanity is introduced to new theories, especially in sociology, economy, and many other fields. We see the rise of psychoanalysis. We see theories by Freud and Jung, and we are introduced to Karl Marx and his ideas and many other intellectual movements. And since we are talking about English literature, it's important to mention that during this modernist period, writers and authors rejected certainty and embraced uncertainty, irony, and introspection. Now, in the next slide, I'll talk about the subperiods, which are early modernism and high modernism. These dates that I provide here are, of course, approximate dates and not fixed or exact. So we can say early modernism, we see symbolism and impressionism, and in high modernism, which is till the end of modernism in 1945, we see the peak of experimentation. Let's now talk about the key elements of modernism and the key characteristics of modernist literature. As I mentioned before, modernism breaks with tradition and it questions the past and it calls for change and adapts to make sense of the changing world. So it doesn't follow the traditions or the old ideas, and it depends on the experimentation of everything. And in modernist literature, we see some characteristics like experimentation, as I mentioned. We are introduced to new styles or new forms of writing, like the stream of consciousness, especially with Virginia Woolf. We'll get to see fragmentation and the rejection of absolute truth, and the break of traditional narratives and structures. And we see themes include identity, isolation, and the search for meaning. The authors and their literary works in the modernist period. This period is really rich and full with innovative writers and new styles and new forms of literature. For example, Virginia Woolf, she captured inner consciousness as she does in her famous story of Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse. And we see Ezra Pound and Franz Kafka and T.S. Eliot, H.D. Lawrence, and many other famous writers. Now, in the next slide, I'll talk about prose and poetry to get to know more literary works and more authors. So let's move on. As far as prose and poetry were concerned, in the modernist period, we are introduced to new styles and new literary techniques. We see the stream of consciousness and the exploration of urban life in the works of James Joyce, like Ulysses and Dubliners. The same applies for Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse. We see new themes such as colonialism, morality, and we see the technique of the unreliable narrator, as in Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. We see literary works by D.H. Lawrence, such as Sons and Lovers. For poetry, we see The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and Yeats. And since we talked about prose and poetry of the modernist authors, let's have a recap and talk about the language and the literary devices used during this period. As I mentioned, we are introduced to the stream of consciousness, symbolism again, interior monologues, juxtaposition, fragmented narrative structures. So, in short, we can say that modernist authors tried experimentations with syntax, structure, and the form. As I mentioned before, modernism is not only about English literature, it includes many other fields such as art and architecture. We see the rise of many different styles and movements like Impressionism, Cubism, Dadaism, Surrealism, Expressionism, and abstract art. Since we are talking about movements, the avant-garde is one of the most important movements. It refers to the innovative, experimental, and radical ideas, especially in arts and culture. Anything that challenges the established norms and traditions. So the avant-garde is a very important word in modernism. This movement has an effect on modernism and postmodernism later. Let's define it as the following. This term comes from the French word vanguard, which means advance guard, originally used to describe troops sent ahead of the main army. So, people in this movement are described as like the front guards, the brave ones that seeking for a change, and they are challenging the traditional ideas. In artistic and cultural contexts, it came to represent pioneers who push the boundaries and introduce new forms, techniques, or concepts. So the avant-garde starts in the late 19th century till the early or mid 20th century. And its core role is to drive modernism, challenging conventional boundaries, especially in art and literature. And its goal is to make it new, which is the core of modernity, as I mentioned in the beginning of the lesson. So, the tone and the spirit of the avant-garde in literature is especially idealistic and serious. And we have innovation and experimentations as the core characteristics of the avant-garde. And most importantly, it calls for the rejection of the mainstream standards, norms, traditions, and it rejects political or philosophical provocations, and always calls for challenging these beliefs or traditions. To recap, the avant-garde is part of modernism. It started in the late 19th century till the mid of the 20th century. Its core role is to drive modernism. Its goal is to make it new, or in other words, to revolutionize art, literature, music, and thought. It includes many other movements within the avant-garde movement, such as Futurism, Cubism, Expressionism, and its tone is serious, idealistic, and in short, we can say that it is the experimental wing of modernism. Of course, modernity has its lasting impact and importance as a literary period in English literature. It paved the way for postmodernism later. It influenced literature, philosophy, art, and many other fields. And it redefined the very idea of what a novel or a poem could be. Its legacy continues in postmodernism, as I mentioned, and it gave us new lenses to view the self, society, and storytelling, and we are still using them today. Now, as we do in every lesson, let's compare between the literary periods we are talking about today, modernism, and the previous one, which is the Victorian age. In the Victorian literature, we see the emphasis or the focus on the social order and realism. In modernism, we see the emphasis on the psychological fragmentation. In Victorian literature, we see clear moral messages. However, in the modernist literature, we see moral ambiguity and we have doubts about everything and what is correct and what is wrong. Victorian literature has omniscient narrators. The modernist literature, on the other hand, has subjective and sometimes unreliable narrators. The Victorian literature is linear, the modernist one is non-linear, and we see faith in progress and civilization in the Victorian literature. However, the modernist literature challenges the norms and the traditions. So, we see some kind of optimism rooted in the human reason in the Victorian period. However, we see the exploration of despair and hopelessness in modernity. So, modernist literature captured the chaos of its time and reshaped literature forever. I hope you found this lesson useful, and I hope to see you in the next video with the last literary periods, postmodernism. See you then.